in jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy podcast, the show which shines a light on the hitherto dark recesses of the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations. As always, as you know, we've got great guests, and today's is absolutely no exception to that. Indeed, he is a very, very well-known journalist, TV, press, and somebody who is extremely interested and has worked within the regions of national security, politics, and particularly with a bent towards Northern Ireland. So it's absolutely fantastic for me to be able to say, welcome to John. I'll let him give you his full name, and I'll let him just outline his career to you. John, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
You could tell the listeners what you have done in the past, so we can work from there.
Well, I followed a pretty orthodox career. I began on a weekly newspaper, went to an evening newspaper, went to Fleet Street, as it then was, and then to television, where I worked on World in Action. It's been closed down for many years, but it was ITV's preeminent investigative program. And then to Panorama at the BBC, and I did a number of strands at the BBC, but most of my time was on Panorama.
Well, you mentioned World in Action, which as a kid growing up, 60s, obviously I was born in the 50s, but in the 60s growing up, it was probably the flagship of investigative journalism. Would you not agree?
Yes, it was certainly the bravest. It was run by a family, the Bernsteins, and supported by some pretty big editorial beasts in the form of David Plowright and Mike Scott and various others. And they put a lot of money and a lot of risk behind some very edgy programs. They tended to be, focused on the sort of left of center of the political spectrum, but still they had some notable successes on a whole lot of programs, the far right, British Steel, the Birmingham pub bombers, and so on. I have to say, it was very good at exposing the bad guys. It didn't have such a deft touch when it came to trying its hand at politics, but it tended to steer away from that, other than in elections and the like.
That's quite interesting, because you said although it was kind of left. Well, I remember John Pilger, who used to do quite a few elements on there, and I would suggest that he was absolutely to the left, and very insightful. Very insightful. So I found it a good program. I've got to be truthful. It's one of the things that I used to watch. He was a youngster, maybe about 10, and it was engrossing for me. So thank you.
Well, I would say, just to clarify one thing, Carlton, although it tended to pick subjects on the centre left, it nevertheless never shied away from mainstream issues like terrorism, I'm pleased to say, and certainly they gave me a lot of money to pursue some of the things the IRA did, people running the IRA, gun running in the United States, and also they were very generous in the funds they gave me in the, late 70s and early 80s, where there was still an issue about fugitives from Nazi Germany living in the United States and South America. And I made a number of programs with decent budgets pursuing various Nazi fugitives. I mean, it was a brave, resourceful, program, and it was a healthy culture in that sense.
Just a quick one on that. Could I ask you how did the economics play out on that? You say they give you a lot of money to do that. What did they get? What was the quid pro quo on their side? Was it just massive viewing figures, or how did that function?
Well, the viewing figures were pretty good. We were head to head with Panorama on a Monday night. Of course, there was no Netflix, there was no cable TV, there was no 24-hour news. So, the sort of center of, the sort of current affairs universe revolved around Monday nights. We had that to ourselves. Of course, things have changed. Out of all perspective today, there's massive competition and probably better for it. But so they put a lot of money into program making. Into on the screen. Money was really no object compared to today, where budgets are real tight, and having a serious impact on the ambition of television investigative journalism, I should say, and to some extent newspaper journalism too.
Yeah, you thought of my next question, because what I was just going to say is, how does that handicap today's individuals who are following you?
Well, it does enormously, because there are no shortcuts to serious investigative journalism. The devil is, as you will know better than anyone, the devil is always in the detail. You have to get stuff past lawyers. If you're making serious allegations about, mass murderers or, wealthy, resourceful people being corrupt, you've really got to be able to go into transmission knowing that if writs arrive, you've got a decent defense and you're willing to risk money in defending it. And, the BBC does that to this day, even though it's under enormous budgetary constraints, and I take my hat off to them. And ITV does it, but not to the same extent. Their compliance regime is much more, quite a lot more cautious than the BBC's. I would say, I think Channel 4's is as well. The BBC, for all its imperfections, and it has a few, but broadly speaking, is by far and away the bravest of all the network broadcasters, in my experience, in the UK.
So you would say then that your work on World in Action was great and groundbreaking, but when you went to Panorama, you're saying that your work was actually even more groundbreaking?
I'll leave it to others to say whether it was groundbreaking or not. But so gosh, let me think. So in 1989, I showed how the leader of Westminster City Council, who was then a sort of,
I do recall her,
Shirley Porter, Dame Shirley,
yep.
was corrupt. She was using public money to advance her own electoral gains, which is not allowed. Now she's a very resourceful individual. She had a lot of money. If we got that wrong, we were in it for millions, but we didn't get it wrong. She didn't sue. And in fact, the district auditor found that we were really rather cautious in our estimates of how much money she'd been abusing. It was, the final tally was up to 30 million. I think we put it at 5. That was brave. And then, gosh, I'm thinking of another brave, there are many brave decisions we've taken. So what I would say was, if you remember the Omagh bombing in Northern Ireland, this was the biggest single act of mass murder in the entire conflict in 1998, when the dissidents of the Provisional Republican movement, who'd broken away, as you know, the real IRA, and they detonated a 500-pound bomb in a busy high street on a Saturday afternoon, causing massive devastation, killing 29 people. Now, the IUC, as it then was, got a bit stuck in its inquiry, and I went over to Belfast and tried to find out why that was the case. In any case, got some terrific leads, and we ended up naming 4 of the bomb gang. Now, again, the legal advice was if we got this wrong, we were in it for millions.
But you knew this how? You knew this how
Well,
from police sources?
Yeah.
Special branch sources?
Yes. Yes, indeed. Special branch sources with an element of I'm going to say it now, an element of cooperation on both sides, as a matter of fact, because we got some footage that I think they hadn't got or wanted. I'm not going to go into that.
What we don't do on the show, and I should make that clear, we never press into areas which could cause problems for anybody, because we're in the secret world, we're talking about it, we are shining a light on it, but we're also respectful of current operations and operations that can be problematic from the past.
These were good people, well motivated, and we spent a lot of time on the ground in that border area of Ireland, which was then a very tricky area to operate in, and known as it was as bandit country.
Yep.
Anyway, we ended up getting some very good evidence, mainly from police sources who weren't able to progress it any further, I have to say, about the telephones these guys had used and how it showed a progression, their movement from north to south and back again. And they were the registered owners of these phones. And so obviously there were some questions which only they could answer as to whether they'd loaned the phones or actually used them on the day. In fact, 2 or 3 of them and use them on the day, was our view. So we named them and we got footage of them at some risk, I might add. Greg Dyke, who was then Director General, was warned that if we got it wrong, it was going to cost a lot of money. But Greg took the risk, and they didn't sue. That's another example of some real editorial courage by the BBC. And actually it had a really useful public interest purpose, not just because we outed them, but actually it triggered for the first time a civil action by the relatives of the victims. The criminal case had hit the buffers, so they pursued their day in court, if you like, through the civil courts. And I can't precisely remember the results now, but they were pretty favourable. I think they got,
which is of course much easier to prove because it's the balance of probability.
That's true, balance of probability. But it was a hell of a thing to arrange. And the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, even Mandelson, was actually very supportive of it. And the programme gave rise to a fundraising campaign for this purpose by the Daily Mail. And as I say, in the end, they had their day in court and they got the verdicts they wanted. So that was a great result, for public service broadcasting. I was very, very satisfied with that.
But I guess what I'm going to say on that is, of course, that played directly into the government's hands insofar as the government would be happy with that result coming forward. Where I have a little bit more of a problem with the BBC potentially, I know the broadcasters. So an ex-CIA colleague of mine once said that Watergate wouldn't have happened in the UK for the pure and simple reason a D notice would have been slapped on it and that would have been the end of it. Now, I couldn't answer back the negative. I couldn't say that's not true. What do you think?
I don't think it is true. I don't think you would get a D-notice on that. I can't see what possible justification there would have been.
Well, you wouldn't have articulated it that way, number one. Second, you'd have articulated it in another manner. Secondly, of course, if you're talking about today, that's one thing. If you're talking about going back to the 1970s, then early 70s,
climate was different.
Then the climate's completely different. So, you quite right. I think that CIA officer is probably telling the truth. To be quite frank.
Well, if you take Thames Television, they were a sort of rival of ours, and they went out. I can't remember. I think did they go on Tuesdays or Thursdays? I can't remember. Anyway, it was called This Week.
Yes,
that was Thames's sort of World in Action. They did some good stuff, and they did Death on the Rock, which was the SAF's shooting dead of the
3IR-18. Yeah,
the 3IR-18. Now, government got very, I think, oppressive on that, and they did make all sorts of threats. And I think that program was entirely vindicated, as a matter of fact, and it was manifestly in the public interest. And I think the government certainly got very heavy-handed. So to that extent, I agree. The climate was tricky, but on the other hand, I'm trying to think now. So I started looking at the role of the intelligence services, some of the intelligence services in Northern Ireland in the so-called undercover war. I don't like to, but people, as you know, Carlton, often refer to it as the dirty war, as if all wars are sort of clean.
There's none that are clean.
Of course. And obviously intelligence gathering, I think the counterterrorism, a counterinsurgency program.
Yep.
Rooted mainly in intelligence it was an obvious way to try to bring the conflict to an end. There are all sorts of controversies about the priorities in that, as you will know, but clearly there was there were examples of dodgy stuff going on. I mean, for example, the army were running a unit. Uniquely, they were allowed to run units, agents in Northern Ireland, but only in Northern Ireland. And there was a lot of it. There was compelling evidence that they were operating as an army would rather than as a police force would run.
Well, exactly. I mean, they probably listened to or read, or I know they did, Brigadier General Kitson's actions in Malaya. So they were working to that sort of, and the actions in Kenya. So they were working to that type of.
That's right. So you had the government saying this is a law and order issue, and yet you had an agency of the state, for example, operating in one case, a guy called Brian Nelson, as the intelligence officer for loyalist terrorists. Using him, and I'm quoting now from some of it was called the Force Research Unit, as you may recall, the unit, and I got access to all of Brian Nelson's contact sheets. These are the sheets that his handlers wrote up after meeting him, and it was perfectly clear that the purpose behind running Nelson was to, and I'm quoting, I think I'm pretty accurately quoting now from one of them, to professionalize the targeting of these loyalists. Now, in other words, make sure they don't kill innocent Catholics, make sure they shoot members of the IRA, but who decides who's a member of the IRA, how sure you are? I mean, what in which part of the spectrum is this? Is he a supporter? Is he an activist? Is he a gunman? Is he a bomber? Is he a fundraiser? What is he? And the thing got completely out of control.
Well, this is the problem with the army carrying out police activity, and you're always going to have that.
That's right. But I suppose what I'm saying is, from a broadcasting point of view, the BBC were very supportive of that. We had some, obviously, objections from the army, but we got it on the air. We made several programs about that, and again, it had a profound.
That's brave. That is brave, because, as you know, certain people were sent out from the police in the UK to do certain jobs to see what was going on, very senior officers, and problems arose with them trying to bring the truth back. So yeah, it's very difficult, and I think that you showed, because you spent many years there, I think you showed and you understood how that was. I think the RUC special branch did not have the same support, for example, as did the army. So nor did the RUC, what was that special unit called of the RUC that were trained by the SAS?
E4A.
Yeah. So
the surveillance people.
There was surveillance team, and then there was the other team that carried out the combative actions. I've forgotten the name, because the surveillance team were working more like the 14th. So I'm trying to remember the name. I've just forgotten the name of. Anyway, HMIUs. Yeah. So the
HMIUs. Yes.
Trained by a special support service. So the problem is that when they carried out actions in the same way that would have been carried out by the army trainers, there wasn't the same defence there. So. You can't do that as a state. You can't say to one section of the state, you can carry on, do as you wish, and another section of the state have somehow got to be different when they're actually working in the same field. That's the point that I'm making. It should be the same for all. And the same should have been to work to police rules. It's dead simple.
Well, that's right. But in reality, so there were 3 intelligence gathering agencies in Northern Ireland, as you know. There was the Special Branch, which was the principal agency. Then there was the Force Research Unit, which was the army. And then, of course, there was a security service.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people, got carried away with the idea that the overarching sort of eyes and ears, power, intelligence gathering, power, the coordinating arm in charge of all intelligence, the security service. It's just not true. The security service were the beneficiaries mainly of intelligence gathered by the police and the army. They did, as you know, run some of their agents, but they were, of the 3 agencies, they were, I think I'm right in saying, running fewer agents than either the army or the police, and they didn't actually have a command and control role. They had a liaison role and an advisory role, but the Force Research Unit were a law unto themselves, pretty much.
Correct. And John, you're right, and that's the problem with the security service overall, because even if you look in the UK, the security service actually doesn't run most of the agents on terrorism. So and definitely within the years you're talking about, that role was with MPSB, Metropolitan Police Special Branch, out of Scotland Yard, and the branch for which I worked also had agents which connected with those in the north of Ireland, obviously, because it had the national responsibility for it in GB. Plus add to that most security services in Europe are police. So what happens is we had very good liaison with our people across Europe, and indeed many parts of the world, but let's just say you keep it to Europe for now, for the IRA struggle. So you would find that, example, when the Roermond shootings happened, I'm a Dutch speaker, it's all the German speaker, I did the translations for Roermond, and I was connecting with my Dutch colleagues who were providing information. So that was not the security service. Now I wasn't on B Squad, which is the Irish section. I was on E Squad, which is our international section. Also, when we were dealing with issues of weaponry coming into Northern Ireland, I was on the Libyan section. So those weapons coming in from Libya, the branch was looking into that. I was looking into that. Yes, in tandem with the security service. But, I had agents that I was running, and the security service had agents they were running, and some agents were ran jointly. So there's a perspective by people outside, and I'd just like to educate people in the show, that somehow the security service is running all the things themselves. It wasn't.
No, it's not true,
it isn't. It just didn't have the people power, even if it wished to. Even if it wished to do that, it definitely didn't have the capacity as police, because it doesn't have powers of arrest. It doesn't have powers to compel people anywhere. Surveillance team wise, the branches, MPSBs now, surveillance teams ran the surveillance on the IRA throughout the whole of the United Kingdom. Well, Great Britain. So obviously in Northern Ireland, the RUC, but throughout Great Britain. And because it was armed and the security service were not armed, example. Now, A4, security service body, did assist in them some of those operations, but definitely were not part of it. What it did have going for it, and this is the big strength of the security service, it is, unfortunately, we live in a class society. It is of the right class. So it could pull the levers in political power, especially when the Cold War ended and it had nowhere to go. So then it could speak politically to others and to Sir John Major, example, to turn around and say, we can do a better job. And as you know, he gave them the role then as a principal intelligence gathers. And notice the word, solely intelligence. Everything else is down to the police. Right? So again, people misunderstand that. And by the way, that sole position of them acting solely by themselves only lasted for about 6 months till they got it all wrong. I mean, we sent bags of people over there. They were seconded to the security service to assist them. And then in the end, it had to be a joint where we had what they called added value from MPSB to it throughout the Great Britain. So it's overplayed. Now, they don't like to tell you this, because you could go back to the founding of the security service, and the guy who founded it was the ex-chief of MPSB. So it has always been basically something that they like to hide, and that's a problem.
Yes. I mean, one of the most interesting, I think in a way, the most interesting dilemma to have emerged from the Northern Ireland conflict, and it has been to some extent gripped, but I don't think, I mean, you would know better than me, but not entirely resolved, is this whole question of the legal framework for running agents, because it had become perfectly clear by the late 80s that agents between the three of them, the three agencies, they penetrated very significantly the IRA and loyalists. I mean, there were literally hundreds of informers and page agents. And as somebody said, milkmaids don't you don't get milkmaids in terrorist organizations. You can't sort of say, if you're an agent and you're asked to drive a car with a bomb in it, you can't say, well, look, I just need to phone
Not
my
today.
and see if he's okay with this, or I don't do bombings. I make the tea, might hide the odd weapon, but don't do bombings. Can't do that. So, and particularly in those days when you might not have an opportunity to scuttle off to a telephone, even if it was working. Absolutely. To get hold of your handler and say, listen, I've got no choice. I've got to get into this vehicle with a 300-pound bomb in it. The target is blah, blah. If you do that, you're going to potentially draw suspicion on yourself, because the circle of knowledge about what the target is very, very tight. You might not even be told the target, and you're just told to drive the vehicle without knowing where you're going to drive the vehicle to. So in the real world of I keep saying this, but obviously you'll know this better than most, but for your listeners, in the real world, the informer agent landscape was just wreathed with legal dilemmas all day long, and no one could find a legal framework that would essentially make what was unlawful lawful. And in the end, as I say, officials in the Northern Ireland have spent months, years with sort of wet towels around their head trying to square this circle. In the end, they couldn't. And the Solicitor General concludes memorably in a memo to colleagues, well, I guess the lesson is don't get caught, quote unquote. That's an actual quote. And that dilemma continued, until I think Reaper, isn't that right?
Yep. It still continues, even with Reaper.
And it still continues, I'm
because,
sure.
as you know, very, very recently, they've had to bring out a qualifying element to Reaper that basically states that agents can, obviously for the listeners again, what people call informants, and in the United States, the FBI would call a confidential informant. What people call informants are in the UK, and by the way, for the Americans, in the CIA, are called agents, because the CIA was created basically by the Brits. They saw how we did it in Secret Intelligence Service MI6 and used that model. So after the OSS ended, so basically they're called agents, and those agents, secret agents who carry out secret work, who are basically handled by officers, intelligence officers, those individuals are carrying out acts that only they can get the information to. Now, there's two problems with that, John, which I want to put to you. One is that you're right, you're looking at terrorism there, and you're looking at what happened in Northern Ireland. Some of those agents paid with their lives for carrying out actions as an agent, and other bodies, let's say Special Air Service, or let's just say UK Special Forces, who were not aware who they were, have obviously, unfortunately, killed some of those individuals. So they paid with their life for that. And I'm sure you're aware, I'm not going to go into the cases, you know this, you were there long enough. But for the listeners, that is what can happen to an agent. Now, the other way of doing that, which is often well known in criminal cases, but is just the same in the secret world, is with officers who carry out the role as undercover officers. Now, people say undercover when they talk some guys in the CID and he just haven't got uniform on. No, that's not what we're talking about. I'm talking about people who live the life of individuals. Now, once again, living that life offers up two very strong and stark issues. If you're living the life, I don't care what the role is, what you're playing, whether it's in terrorism, or whether it's in subversion, or whether it's in espionage, or whether it's in counter-proliferation, whatever you're living that life in to prevent, if you really want to have any longevity and you're not brought up with the people. Now, the thing is, often with the agents, what we do is we take somebody in the organization and we've molded them to us for whatever reason. They come to us. If you're putting somebody into that organization, straight away, they are at threat. So you're an officer going into that organization. You're the one who hasn't grown up with these people. You're the one who is new. Now, hopefully you let them drag you in, but the bottom line is you're never fully 100% the same as the ones who've been it from the beginning. So you've got to be ultra careful. And what happens is, invariably, and to be truthful, only MPSB was doing this. I'm talking about being full-time undercover. I'm not talking about you being there for, a day and then going home at night or whatever it might be. I'm talking about you for years on end, living the life of whatever you're trying to do. You will, within a very short period of time, learn two things. One is going to be, in doing it, you will soon learn you have to take on the beliefs of the party you're with, because if you don't, it will show up. And number two, you'll get to like the party you're with, and you will just be one of them. And the biggest thing for and they're not really handlers, you can't say handlers because they're officers who are doing it. The biggest thing for the officers that are trying to control the officers doing this role, and there's very few people who know about it, is to keep these people on side, because Stockholm syndrome happens. Within a short period of time, you believe and you're exactly the same as those individuals. And that's where the problem lies. Now, you're going to get grade A intelligence because you're going to be one of them, but your mind is going to be with them. And that then thereafter creates for you massive problems in mental illness. But the people sitting from outside then subsequently judging you, come in and say, oh, well, you shouldn't have been doing this, or you shouldn't have been doing that, or whatever. They put you in place. So you've got exactly the same dilemma. And it's a worse dilemma because you're an officer. So it really is something that people need to be instructed about, because at the end of the day, if you can't protect your own officers, why would agents want to come with you? Because if you're going to out your own officers, why does an agent believe you're not going to out them? And the fact that it's a police body doing it makes no difference because, as I said to you before, most security services around the world are police. So agents just think, well, hang on, how can I trust British intelligence? It's a sad thing that's happening.
Absolutely. I mean, these are an enormous dilemmas for, I mean, what that does to recruitment is just awful, isn't it? I mean, the stock price goes plummets.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a very difficult, it's very tricky. I mean, all these issues, interestingly, just finishing off Northern Ireland, but bringing the dilemma up to date, if you like, as you probably know, Carlton, there is about to conclude anyway, a 5-year investigation into the sort of quintessential dilemma that gathers all these dilemmas together in the form of an agent called Steak Knife.
Yep.
And there's this inquiry being conducted by former Chief Constable of Bedfordshire, John Boucher. And Steak Knife was an agent that was in the IRA's own internal security unit. So this guy his responsibility was to essentially do what MI5 does in the UK, to find people who are betraying the organization.
Yeah.
Like
which led to death, of course, for those individuals.
Which, of course, there was no, absolutely, the punishment was, as they say in Belfast, going for your tea. That's the vernacular.
Yeah.
And so there is Steak Knife, whose real name was Freddie Scappaticci, responsible, and he became head of this organization, the Internal Security Union, responsible for spotting, investigating, and interrogating British agents within the IRA, and it would end up on a number of occasions with there being 2 agents in the interrogation room, but one of them knowing that both of them were agents.
Yeah.
And this has, raised the most acute moral dilemmas, because inevitably someone in the end had to end up playing, if you like, God, because the handlers would eventually become aware, on some occasions, not on all occasions, that one of their agents was being interrogated by another of their agents. And I think the issue that Boucher has been looking at is, was one agent sacrificed in order to protect a more valuable agent, namely Steak Knife? And did this happen on a number of occasions? And I think that the way his inquiry has been going rather suggests that that is his conclusion. We await his conclusion, of course. He's scheduled to produce an interim report next year.
You see, I would imagine that it's not as black and white as that. And the big problem is when you ask senior officers, regardless of where they're from, to look into issues who don't understand what the role is like, it's very, very difficult, because they see a perception, oh, this is what the law says, this is how it runs in a criminal thing, this is how it goes. It's not the same. So you're basically, you've got a problem in Britain. And the problem is it does not want to acknowledge a secret police, a police intelligence agency. It doesn't want to acknowledge it. Right. So you have that problem. So what they're saying is, okay, this is how it should have been lined up. This is what should have happened. And the same goes for the Troubles in general. We just want to call it the Troubles. We don't want to say this is a civil war. Right. Yeah. So what we're actually doing is we're minimizing and then saying everything can be dealt with as a police perspective.
Yeah.
I'll tell you 2 things which will come to, and I'd love to hear your points. One was back in 2004, 2003, 2004, I was doing a lot in Iraq, taking people there. I was in the branch at this time. I'd been in Secret Intelligence Service, so I had a lot of contacts, and I was taking people to Iraq. When I say people, I'm talking high levels of government, ministers, whatever, contracts of war. Wars are fought to get work contracts and whatever else happens. So we're going there to see how it all runs, and I'm taking people over there. And obviously I'm dealing with our people and I'm dealing with the Americans. And the Americans had basically chalked everything off for themselves. So they had, Rumsfeld was smart enough with the former vice president. And what they'd done is they'd said, right, this is what we're going to do. We're going to run Iraq as ours. We're going to get the oil. We're going to get this, that, and the other. And everything else works off there. So to make sure that was the case, they put in charge of basically made him the Home Secretary of Iraq and in charge of the security service of Iraq, the new service that there would be, was the former chief of the New York police, a guy whom I knew. And so I went there on occasion. I was with Jack Straw to do some stuff. And basically, I met the guy and we were talking, blah, blah, blah. And he was a nice enough fella. And I know, and they used to call him Kojak because he had a bald head, carried 2 pistols like Kojak. And he was a flamboyant individual, this American. He ended up in prison subsequently. But basically what happened is General Sir Freddie Viggers and the head of station, whom obviously I can't name, whom I knew very well from the service when I used to work there. Basically, they and David Vaness, who's the Assistant Commissioner for Specialist Operations, they'd hatched up this scheme that I would be the head of the Iraqi Special Branch. Okay, so I'd set the Iraqi Special Branch up and I'd head it because it was going to ratchet. Now, the reality is before the war started, I had said we should not be involved in it. And I wrote a paper on it, and I wrote my reasons why I was dealing with Iraq when I was in the service, and I dealt with Iraq when I was in Special Branch. So my reasons were dead simple. We are going to kill a whole load of people, and those people will then turn around and hate us, and we will recruit people to terrorist organizations. And it won't just be Al-Qaeda. It'll be a whole load of others, which has come to pass. So the bottom line was, it's a bad idea. Leave Iraq as it is. Anyway, they don't. We go into war because the American is going to do that no matter what, and we follow. And so we are now playing catch up. What can we get out of it? So the suggestion was, we'd love you to be the head of Special Branch. Now, I said to them, dead simply, I would have to hire all the people Saddam used to have, because they got rid of all the Baptists at one stage. Most stupid thing going, but they did. I said, all the people that Saddam hired previously, I'd have to rehire them. And those guys are going to do the work they were doing under Saddam. They'll put a lid on it. I kind of no doubt they'll put a lid on it. The tactics would be that, people's fingernails will be there and all the rest of it. And I don't want to be part of that, because even if it goes fantastically, swingingly well, and they are not killing people en masse, which they were doing at the time, they were saying to people, do you want a job as an electrician or something? Come on this bus. And then the bus would be rigged with explosives and they blow the whole bus up, 100 odd guys dead. Whatever. It just dastardly stuff was going on. So, a lid needs to be put on it. Who's going to do that? And the only people who can do that are the people who know the game. And if you bring those people back who know the game, they're going to do it in their way. And I'm going to be the most hated man in Iraq. And, if I don't get killed there, 5 years later, I'm going to be gripping the rails in Den Haag because I'm going to be a war criminal. Now, this is the problem with people not. I should never have been offered that role. I should never.
Well, you're basically enunciating, I think, what Colin Powell said, warned, if you break it, you own it. And
correct. And I know Colin Powell. Correct. That is the dilemma. And that's why he didn't want to break it in the first instance. And so now it's broken. Now you got to solve it. And at the same time, and this is where the problem lay for the United States, which had 538,000 soldiers and sailors, whatever, in the game in the beginning. They want to bring all those people back home because the vast majority were basically at threat. So what you want to do is you want to limit that threat. You don't want to be like in the Second World War and keep 1 million men there all the time for the next 40 years. You want to limit that and put private soldiers in, because who cares less whether some private soldiers killed who's working for 100,000 a week or whatever it might be. Yeah. So that's what they were trying to play. And by the way, Rumsfeld owned some of that company that were doing that, Blackwater and others, right? As did this guy who was the chief in New York. So
Kojak chap. What was
absolutely.
his name? I can't remember. I know who you mean.
His name is, and I've just forgotten it. I'll come back to you because my brain's terrible. I'll come back to it and I'll give you his name. Nice enough fella, tells some great stories. And if you read my book, Black Ops, The Incredible True Story of a British Secret Agent, I name him in there. And I tell you exactly what he told me. He told me a fantastic story. I won't say it now, but it just showed you how he was, how much the law meant nothing to him. Right? I can put it that way, right? His was a matter of getting the job done, right? That's how he thought was the game. And that's why he was ideal for the job there. And that's why he got it. But the price to be paid for that, for somebody who is not so, would be you're going to pay a massive price subsequently. So this is what states do. They bring about things and then think, oh, how do we fix it afterwards? Now, in Northern Ireland, and the last bit we'll do on Northern Ireland, was that your opinion of what was happening there?
No, I don't think so. It wasn't. Well, first of all, it wasn't as brutal.
No, clearly not as brutal.
I mean, it was brutal, but it wasn't as brutal as Iraq. These were, as the saying goes, ordinary decent terrorists. In the sense that most of them, when they planted a bomb, wanted to get away alive.
And of course, they told people, didn't they, about it generally?
Generally, not always, I have to say, but generally. So it wasn't anything like as brutal as Iraq. And
sorry, I should mention that I'm looking at it from the perspective of the police and the military trying to deal with the issue, not really.
Yes, sure.
That's what I'm trying to look to.
No, but what I'm saying is that therefore the reaction of the military and the police wasn't as it wasn't as oppressive or as robust. No, look, I mean, I think there are obviously always exceptions, and if you spend enough time in West Belfast, you'll be hard pressed to find a good word to be said about any aspect of the intelligence gathering operation in Northern Ireland. That's not my view. I think, the people that I knew in the special branch, and generally speaking, were pretty moral sort of people who I think, try to operate in the right way. But there wasn't a Human Rights Act in those days. There wasn't. I don't think lawyers didn't rely anything like to the same extent that they do now on the European Convention of Human Rights, and certainly for the early part of the conflict, the army were in charge of security. So they took an army-like approach to the problem. They didn't take a policing type approach. But by and large, I think. That said, though, that there is this the term collusion has crept into the lexicon big time in Northern Ireland, and it essentially refers to agents being allowed to operate outside of a legal framework. We've discussed how almost impossible that is. But it is the case, sadly, that a number of agents were allowed to operate with impunity, and so they had the best of both worlds. They got paid for their intelligence, but they were also allowed to operate as terrorists without any restraint, with very few restraints, really, by their handlers, and that. That has been exposed, and it has damaged the image and the reputation of the agencies quite considerably.
And I think it may well be as I said, it may well be the case that we were looking for people to perform a role in a manner that was unrealistic.
I agree. I agree.
That may be another element to it.
No,
Did you see that? Because I'm conscious of time, and you won't look. If you'd come back on the show at another time, we can go into other areas, because we haven't touched. I know you did something on Spycatcher. I know you did other political elements that I would actually love to get involved in. We haven't even looked at the Cold War element of the Irish issue. It may not be writ large in the issue itself, but it's definitely writ large from the people who aided and assisted. We only need to talk about Czechs. We only need to talk about Libyans and others who've made assistance based on that Cold War element. So we haven't even touched on that, which would be just as interesting to listeners as well, because that was the prism from which everything else was seen. And it's often overlooked in an Northern Ireland context.
I mean, I don't know how many of your listeners will know about Spycatcher. It was an absolutely seminal case, of course. This was Peter Wright, who was an assistant Director General of the Security Service, but that was really the sort of dying gasp of that Cold War era. And for me, it was fascinating because I and a colleague, Paul Greengrass, who's subsequently become a very successful, famous Hollywood
well-known, yeah.
Terrific programs Paul has made, films, I should say, 1993 amongst them. Anyway, Paul and I went out to Tasmania, and I think we were one of the first teams really to sit down with a real-life member of a real-life spy, quite a senior one, Peter Wright. We spent literally 6 weeks at Peter's feet as he unburdened a list of members of the establishment, largely, who he asserted or suspected were deep penetration Russian agents. I mean, the list went on and on. And it got to the point where you sort of thought, hang on, Peter. And he'd say, well, what about Lord so-and-so? And he'd say, yes, I think he was a spy. And, what about blah, blah. Yes, we had doubts about him, and so on and so on. And it just got silly. And I remember I ended up thinking, how did this guy become Assistant Director General of the Security Service? It was quite troubling. And I think, the service has obviously professionalized quite a bit since then. But that was quite an eye-opener, because it really was Reds under the beds. It just wasn't, paranoia was so acute. And many of these people, I'm sure, were completely innocent.
But you know how the service worked in the old days, don't you? Basically, you were hired because you were a good sort, and you were a family friend of whomever, and you went to the right. I could actually say Oxford, Cambridge, St Andrews, Durham. Basically, that's about it. So the Soviet penetration of those areas was simple. Just got 3 or 4 different universities, and you're good to go. So that was your problem. So, but his claim to fame, as I understood it, I think I met the fellow once, was that he was actually a technical individual.
That's right.
Very few of them were at all technical. So this guy got in based on that.
You're absolutely right, Carlton. He began life with Marconi, I think it was.
That's right. Yeah.
And he was a bit of a technical whiz, but he had no background in counter espionage, and that he was the last of these sort of professional amateurs, if you like.
That's a good way to put it.
And it was, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the people were selected for who you knew, not what you'd really done, partly anyway.
Yeah.
And of course he ended up he ended up being convinced that the Prime Minister Harold Wilson was in some shape or form a Soviet asset, which was immensely damaging, of course, to.
Well, the Americans believed it.
Some of the Americans did, as you know, James Angleton.
Yeah.
The sort of brilliant, but
had great power. So he was able to push it to most of the other Americans.
These were the flat earthers, weren't they?
Yeah.
Of the CIA, who saw spies everywhere. But on the other hand,
there were enough. On the other hand, there were enough people there. That's the other hand of it.
The Soviets had penetrated.
Correct.
And we ended up in what the author of a brilliant book, I've forgotten the author's name, title called A Wilderness of Mirrors, which I think really captures the state of paranoia that just infected rational thought. And Peter was part of that problem, really, that post-war problem.
Well, I think once you'd had 4, stroke 5,
yeah,
I think that then people thought, well, why not 8 and 10?
Yeah, true. I mean, you're thinking of Burgess MacLean, Philby,
absolutely.
So
yeah. So why not the rest of them? And of course, you had individuals who weren't outed because of who they were within the establishment.
Peter was, bless him. I was very fond of Peter, but he was crazy. Crazy. That's slightly unfair. So it ends up with, as you know, Malcolm Turnbull,
who
then became Prime Minister of Australia, representing Peter in court, because
I do recall it.
The government, there was this famous trial in Australia where the book was seized essentially by the government. I mean, they blocked it. And there was a hearing in Australia, and before an Australian judge, and in the witness box was Sir Robert Armstrong.
Yes.
Why, trying to explain to the Australians why this book should be banned, and they reached Sir Robert was sort of weaving and ducking around some of these Turnbull's questions. And there came a point in the proceedings when the Australian judge became visibly irritated, and he threw his pen down. He said, "I'm getting tired of the serpentine weavings of the British government."
Yep.
And it was, I think, a moment when an acerbic Australian judge just had enough of the sort of masterly Whitehall finessing of truths, and that was it, really.
Well, Turnbull changed everything because he asked the one simple question, didn't he? He said, "Is there such a thing as the British Secret Service?" Right now, everybody knew there was. Right?
Yes,
and there could not be, because everybody said there is, and there is a body, and it wasn't ASIO then. I think they called the Aussie system different name by it. Or it might have just become ASIO at the time. Anyway, whichever, because I used to deal with them. And they asked a basic question, and I'll have to go back to Whitehall for that. Now, and then came back. I think Mrs. Thatcher then told them to say there isn't such a thing. And then you come back and say, well, if we can't trust you on that issue, what can we trust you on? So that was it, finished, end of story.
No, it was preposterously
absolutely. And that's where the problem lay.
Yes, it was
over secrecy. Just admit it. Yes, there is such an organisation.
And then, just to finish, if I may, because it's an interesting story. This so Paul and I came back and put this Spycatcher. It was the first time a senior member of the intelligence services had been, had given a very long and detailed interview on network television, and it caused a hell of a row, as you might imagine. And then Paul published Peter's book, Spycatcher.
Yeah,
Paul wrote the book. I decided.
Oh, so did Peter not write it then?
No, Paul wrote it.
Interesting.
And I I went off to write a book about the Auschwitz Dr. Mengele.
Yeah.
I didn't want to write the book because I didn't entirely believe Peter. So anyway, the book was published, and then there was this furore about the Wilson plot, and Peter claiming there'd been a plot and all the rest of it. And I didn't really believe Peter about. I thought Peter was exaggerating. So anyway, the short story is that we eventually got a team. I was now on Panorama to go and interview Peter about this, and Peter, because I knew Peter, agreed to be interviewed. But Turnbull laid down some very strict conditions.
Right.
That he should. I don't think I've told this story before. It's quite an interesting story. So the future Prime Minister of Australia laid down some very strict conditions that I should share with him whatever tapes we got of Peter. Obviously, I assume because Turnbull realized that there may be some weaknesses in Peter's story.
Mm-hmm.
And Turnbull was obviously justifying publication on public interest grounds that, you know, there were lots of scandals and Wilson was a possible Soviet asset and all the rest of it. So we went off to interview Peter, and I shot hours and hours of tape with him, and bit by bit, he sort of, his story more or less collapsed.
Right.
So how many people Peter really suspected Wilson of being a spy? Well, a number of us. How many? Me, and, well, you know, two or three, right? So that's not the service as a whole. I suppose not. So bit by bit, he bless him, he retracted quite a lot. Did I write that? Yes, you did, Peter. It's here. No, well, that's probably pushing it a bit, and so on. So I came back with these tapes, and Turnbull, and I sort of suspected that Turnbull would have a real problem. So I did something really rather swervy, but I'm very glad I did. I made copies of these tapes.
Oh, fantastic.
Went to see Turnbull, and Turnbull said, "You can't possibly take these back to the UK. This is..."
Good accent.
But basically, Turnbull was saying it's contempt of court because it'll screw my case.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't contempt of court. And I'm going to have to impound these tapes. But I will undertake to give them back to you when this case is over. So I let him have the tapes, thinking they were the only copies.
Yes.
Took them back to the UK, and about a week before transmission, Turnbull discovered that we had got a spare set, and threatened to sue the BBC for breach of contract because he made me sign away the tapes. And this caused an enormous kerfuffle in the BBC, and the Director General, John Burt, and the legal team, and everybody all had this meeting. And the legal advice was, well, John has, I'm afraid, committed the corporation to a legal undertaking, and therefore, if Turnbull sues, we'll have a problem. So John Burt turned to me and he said, "Well, John, why'd you sign it?" And I said, "Because I was under duress. I was in no different position to a, person being threatened with, being threatened with something unless they made an admission to something else." But the public interest clearly lies in us broadcasting the collapse of Peter Wright's case, and I would hope that any court would see that. And John, I remember John sat there with his fingers in his ear and thought, after a minute, said, I think John's right. Send a fax, or telex as it was, or then in those days, or a fax. I think Turnbull basically telling them to F off with publishing. And we did. And of course, Turnbull never carried out his threat. This is the Prime Minister of Australia. And I remember we were then on the date of Turnbull was in London, and we were both due to give to join the World Service for a broadcasters. And I walked into Broadcasting House, the World Service as it was. There was Turnbull, and he stood up and he said, "You must be the most dishonest man in Britain." And I said, "No, Malcolm, I think it applies to you. But if you want to say so on air, be my guest and I'll explain why I, as they say in Belfast, dirty Joed you, because there was a public interest." And of course, we both got into the studio and both behaved ourselves, and he didn't dare make an allegation against me, so I didn't have to rebut it. And that was it. We haven't spoken since, mind you. Brilliant. John, that, unfortunately, I keep the show bite-sized so people can get on the train and put their ear plugs in and listen to the show, and so they can commute with it. So we've run over an hour, my friend, an hour and 15. So that's because it's great having you on. And we haven't touched the sides. So, John, would you come back on the show? Sure, anytime. Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, I'll be asking you back on because there's a whole host of issues. And by the way, the name of the guy was Bernie Kerrick.
Yes.
So if you get the book, you have a look at it. And he did time in a federal prison thereafter. Do you know that?
Yes. What was that? Corruption or something, I suppose.
Well, this is a guy who flew. If you read the book, John, you'll understand what he did. He didn't get done for anything like that. He basically got done for something dead simple. And you know what it was? Right. Well, actually, what was happening is that he was being put forward because Rudy Giuliani, who's a good friend of his, was going up as to be president. They wanted to push him, and Bernie was going to back him. Back him through. So they wanted rid of him. And somebody realized that he'd hired a Mexican cleaner who was illegal.
Oh, right.
And he lied when asked.
I see.
You see what I'm saying? This is how this was his downfall. So for all the things he did, that's what got him. It is incredible. But that's the truth. So, John, listen, thank you very, very much. Listeners, you have had the time of your life. You have listened to a man who, for many, decades, has been involved in reporting at the highest level, both for Granada and ITV programs, and, of course, the flagship British broadcaster, the BBC. And what you heard, including the past life of an Australian Prime Minister, is something that you don't hear on most of the shows. John, thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure.
And listeners, we will see you, or you will hear from me next week. Thank you very much.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.